Hi, I'm Jeff Belknap along with Eric Villar from Motive Gear. Today we're going to take you through an installation on an 8.8 Ford. This particular customer wanted to do a gear ratio change, so we're taking out a 430 gear ratio and putting in a 410. Along with it, we're adding a spool, and we're using our complete master bearing kit. Replaces everything you need to do the job, gives you ring gear bolts, shims, everything that we need. So time to get started, and first thing we'll do is mount the ring gear onto the spool. Eric, if you want to help me with that. Okay. First step that we had done is went ahead and dressed the gear, and what we do is take off any imperfections or burrs in the manufacturing process, and that just makes sure that you're getting a nice smooth roll pattern as you're rolling the gear through, and it doesn't have take any chances of any chips or anything along those lines. As Eric puts the ring gear onto the spool, a few tools that are required. You want a dial indicator. One like this with a magnetic base works great to check your backlash. Set of calipers, digital or not, to inspect all of your shims for thicknesses. And lastly, a good torque wrench. You want me to start a couple more?
For me, if you wouldn't mind.
What you'll want to do on this is, as you hold it up with your hand, is slowly bring them up. Slowly bring the ring gear up to the spool. Generally we like to do it in a star pattern. And always want to make sure you have red Loctite on these bolts. Okay, next what we'll do is use our torque wrench. This particular bolt and application requires 60 foot-pounds, which we already went ahead and set the torque wrench to.
One thing we recommend at Motive Gear is to pre-lube the bearing. We've already done that. That'll prevent any kind of dry startup. It just takes a light coat, put the race on there, spin it, and you're good to go.
Up next is the pinion setup. We went ahead and off of our old pinion gear, we had found that we had a 27,000 shim. So we're going to start off with that. And what we had done to make life a little easier on the inner pinion bearing, instead of having to press it on and off if your pattern is off, what we had done is hone this bearing out. So what it allows it to do is just slide it on and off. Once you have your achieved pattern, you can go back through and press your bearing on.
Before we start installing anything new, we're going to inspect the housing for any nicks and burrs where the bearing races go in. We're going to make sure it's clean. We've already gone ahead and taken all the gasket material off from the old rear end. And with our new Motive Gear Master Install Kit, we're going to go ahead and replace all the bearings. So we've punched out the bearing race from the front, the inner and outer bearings, and we're going to go ahead and install those now. It's important to know that you've seated the bearing all the way in, otherwise that'll play with your pinion depth. And we're good to go.
Now that Eric has went ahead and got the pinion bearing races installed completely into the housing, we're going to go ahead and install the pinion. And like we showed you earlier, we use the setup bearing, so that way if we have to make a pinion depth change, it's real simple to do. Also, we recommend for the first exercise, just leave your crush sleeve out, leave your pinion seal out, and what we'll do is just put a little preload on the bearings, similar to what you're going to have, which is usually about 19 to 23 inch-pounds of pressure. You can do this step by yourself. It's a lot easier having a buddy or somebody hold the pinion from the back side.
So the outer pinion bearing actually has a pretty tight fit on the pinion, so that's why we're going to run it in with a gun. We ran it in with just enough preload to take all the play out of the pinion. The pinion can't have any in or out play. And our next step, we're going to put the carrier in and run our pattern.
Now that our pinion gear is all set in place, what we'll be doing now is figuring out our adjustment for the carrier shim preload. We went ahead and took notes from our earlier disassembly, and we had found that we had 290 thousandths on one side and 285 on the other. In our Motive Gear kit, we give you multiple shims to use, so you can get a wide range and cover all your bases for whatever thickness you may need. A quick little tip, we use a little grease, kind of just keeps all the multiple shims from sliding around. And you can do the same thing, put it a little bit on the inside as you put it into the housing. That'll kind of help hold it into place. Eric, if you want to give me a hand, we'll get this side started. What we'll basically try to do here is get these shims all sitting into place and seated properly. A couple different ways you can do it. You can tap them in with a rubber mallet to start them, and then from there, if needed, you can use a brass punch, a drift, and slightly tap them in.
The one thing with the carrier preload, you always need to make sure that you have carrier preload. And there's no real measurement to that. One good way to know is when the carrier goes into the housing, you shouldn't be able to just put it in there. You have to put it in with a mallet. You should have to tap it.
Now that we have our carrier into the housing, we have our desired preload going in. We're going to go ahead and put our caps on. Now, just make a note, since this is only a setup, we're not on our final installation. What we're doing is just going to put these on and bring them down with the gun flat, so that way at least we know our carrier is seated all the way. On our final installation area of this, we'll go ahead and torque them down to 85 foot-pounds, which is required on these 8.8 model differentials.
One thing to note is the carrier bearing caps are matched per side of the differential. So earlier in the disassembly, before we took it all apart, we actually marked which cap goes to which side of the differential.
Go right in. Go ahead. Now that our carrier's in and we have our desired preload, we're going to go ahead and check our backlash. We generally recommend anywhere from about 8 to 10 thousandths of backlash. This one we're sitting right at about 8 thousandths, so that is good. Now, if you happen to put the carrier in, and let's say you have too much backlash, if you're 20 thousandths or so, if your preload's correct, what you'll want to do is take shim off of your non-ring gear side and apply it to your ring gear side. That will tighten your backlash. If your backlash is too tight, you'll do the opposite. You'll pull shim away from the ring gear side and add it to the non-ring gear side.
Go ahead.
Now that our backlash is set where we want it, we went ahead, we're going to put the gear marking compound on, and we're going to run a test pattern. We'll see how our depth looks and go from there. One thing that you'll want to make sure is that you did set your preload pretty tight on the pinion. That'll help kind of address the pattern and make it really stand out for you. A couple ways to do it is you can use your hand and go back and forth with the carrier. I like to use a wrench, put it on one of the ring gear bolts, and run it through a couple times. And we'll roll it back around. And as you can see, the drive side of the gear, we're nice and centered on it, have a nice looking pattern, and as well as on the coast side. So for us, we know now that our setup, our pinion shim, our pinion preload, and our backlash is set correctly. So we can take the carrier back out, take the pinion back out, and press our bearing on, and do our final assembly. We're going to talk a little bit about pinion depth and gear looking patterns. This particular pattern, as you can see on the drive side of our gear, we're nice and centered, making great contact. And on our coast side, you can see we have a nice centered pattern. If we had a pattern where we're concentrated out towards the top, which is called the heel of the tooth, we would want to add pinion shim, so we drive the pinion deeper in towards the bottom, which is considered the toe side of the gear. And basically what happens is your coast side will follow whichever way you move the drive side. Both your patterns will want to cancel each other out. Now that we have our desired pinion depth, and you can see as we showed earlier on our gear pattern, we went ahead and took off our setup bearing and had our new bearing pressed on with our desired shim that we had originally put in there. The next step what we'll be doing is going ahead now and putting a crush sleeve and our pinion seal in as we put the pinion in. This particular application is a performance application, and Motive Gear, we make a solid spacer, which is basically going to eliminate the need for a crush sleeve. And what that will do is ensure preload at all times. There's no movement in it. Very highly recommend go ahead and doing this at any type of performance aspect.
Okay, so we've got our seal in the housing. We're going to go ahead and put our crush sleeve or solid pinion spacer on. We're going to use the new nut this time. We recommend using red Loctite on the nut as well. And then we'll put the yoke on and set the pinion preload to, for new bearings, 23 inch-pounds.
Now that our pinion is installed and our desired pinion preload is achieved, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our carrier for our final inspection. Now that at this point, we're going to go ahead and put our caps on, our bearing main caps. One thing we also like to highlight is on these is to use red Loctite. On this particular application, we'll be torquing them down to 85 foot-pounds. So now that our main caps are torqued down to our 85 foot-pounds of torque, we recommend going back through one last time just to make sure your backlash is exactly where you wanted it and you had before, that nothing had changed. And you can see we are right where we were, which was right at about 8 thousandths. It is also good at times to check it in multiple spots if you're reusing your original carrier versus a new one. Sometimes you can get a little bit of a bend, or some tolerances might change a little bit. So it's always good to check it maybe in about 3 spots. And on this one, we're looking really good. Okay, so now your next step would be to go ahead and install your axles. This particular vehicle is equipped with a spool, so the axles are retained on the outer end out by the brake calipers. On a traditional setup, you would have your cross pin that you removed originally. You would go ahead and remove it from here, put your axles in, install your C-clips, put your cross pin back in, and at that point, you can go ahead and put your cover on.
We've got our cover all sealed up. We've got it full of oil. We recommend an 80-90 weight or with at least a GL5 or better rating. From here, we're going to put our brakes on and put the tires on. This job's all done.
Motive Gear offers a full range of ratios to choose from. We do street performance, we do off-road, regular car applications. For more on all of our lines, please go visit summitracing.com.